Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 deals with identity development processes. So we're going to go through each of the different identity development processes among minority group members and also majority group members. And we will also be looking at the various ways that people develop identity based on the three paradigms of social science, interpretive, and critical perspectives. From a social science perspective, we can think about identity in terms of part self and part group based. Well, what does this really mean? Well, identity, as many of you already know from your experiences transitioning into college, going through college, choosing your majors, starting new jobs, getting assimilated to those organizations, many of us wear multiple hats in any given day, right? We have multiple identities. What this means is that the identity that I tend to express or evoke or focus on when I'm at work, let's say, is going to be different than some of the identity work that I do when I'm at home or maybe when I'm with friends or family members, right? So think about how your communication adapts or is modified based on who you're communicating with, right? When you're in the public sphere, you tend to communicate much more professionally. You tend to speak in a colloquial way. You tend to modify your dress or your clothing in a way where you look professional, right? You tend to talk to people perhaps about topics that are appropriate in the public forum, right? However, if we look at the way in which our interactions change when we're communicating with family or friends, we can definitely see that our identity is partially shaped by the group in which we're interacting with at any given time. So for me personally, and many of you maybe can relate to this, when I'm interacting with my spouse or family or friends, I tend to be much more informal. I tend to be much more honest about what I actually think. I tend to be much more socially engaged. When I say socially engaged, I mean I get into more in-depth discussions with people that I'm close to. We talk about topics that I may not talk about in public because I maybe don't think it's appropriate. So we can look at these different ways in which we transition our communication, both verbal and nonverbal, based on who we're talking to. And we can see how identity is enacted or performed, if you will, based on our self-knowledge and our self-participation or our self-awareness, but also the awareness that we have about the various groups that we are communicating with and what those social expectations or norms are in those groups. According to Rowland, and Rowland is cited in the Judith Martin and Thomas Nakayama textbook. According to Rowland, most human beings, or all human beings, have three universal aspects of identity. The first of these is the individualized or the I focus. Well, what are some things that you think would be included in the individual aspect of identity? We could certainly look at things like self-identity. Who do I see myself as? We could look at things like self-esteem. How do I feel about myself? We could also look at things like long-term goals for the life that you're living. What kinds of goals do I want to achieve in my lifetime? What are the values that I see myself spending my life fulfilling? Okay, these are all aspects of the individualized identity that shapes who we are, who we become, and of course, how we see ourselves. We can also think about identity in terms of a familial or a we focus. So from this perspective, we can think about the family in which we were raised. And I've said this before in this course, but our family systems really constitute the first cultural system that we belong to. And I say this because our familial systems are our first experience and our major socialization in terms of how to view the world, what kinds of lenses we view the world through, the ways that we view communication with regards to interacting with people, and of course how we expect to treat others and be treated ourselves. Many of these ideas are formed in the family unit. And of course, it goes without saying that our families certainly shape views that we have of ourselves, and that we tend to be influenced by family systems, both in terms of our family of origin, which is the family that we're born into, but also later in life when we transition into creating our own families or our family of procreation. These are definite aspects of identity, and you may find that your identity can shift over time as well with regards to which family unit you tend to prioritize. So over the course of one's life, their family of origin may be the most important family system to them for the first 20 or 30 years. But then when you partner up with someone, if you decide to do that, and you have children, if you decide to do that, then the priority becomes your family of procreation. So even the idea of what kinds of priority we place on certain aspects of family is something that can transition over the course of your life. But we can also think about identity as something that tends to be experienced through the spiritual or the higher focus. So what do we mean when we say that somebody has a spiritual identity? Well, spirituality is certainly not the same thing as religion, although many people who are religious might consider themselves to also be very spiritual. I'm sure that you might also find people who consider themselves religious that do not consider themselves spiritual. Certainly, spirituality is a very personal, private process. However, one thing that Roland found in his research is that most human beings tend to have some kind of a focus that influences their identity that is based on a entity or a higher power or a spiritual power, if you will, that is larger than themselves, larger than the human experience. And, why are the individual, familial, and spiritual issues very important for human beings? Well, it seems like these three categories tend to influence or comprise, if you will, many of the interactions that we have. You think about the individual interactions that we have with ourselves throughout the course of our lives. One could argue that the relationship that we have with ourselves is one of the most important relationships that we will ever have. But we can also look at the profound impact that our family systems have on who we become and what kinds of activities and values we tend to focus on in life. And finally, we can definitely see how human beings use spiritual or religious activities in order to try to make sense or alleviate, if you will, the one part of the human experience that most people are somewhat uncomfortable with, right? And when I talk about that, I am discussing the aspect of being a human being, which deals with coming into the world and leaving the world, right? There's an impermanence about our existence in the world that is very difficult for human beings, some human beings, to reconcile on their own, right? So this could be one of the reasons why we tend to see through history that most cultures and civilizations have had a spiritual or higher focus. And it's definitely something worth considering in terms of your own life and your own participation in identity communication processes. Now, from the interpretive perspective, we can look at culture as something, and identity more specifically, as something that is co-created. Well, what does that mean? Well, there are certain types of expectations that I might have in my life that have been placed upon me by society, but I also have expectations in my life that I have developed myself, right? And sometimes it may be difficult to distinguish where the expectations that others have for you begin and where yours begin, right? But one thing to think about is, especially in terms of the interpretive perspective, is that identity is something that can be challenged, resisted, and redefined. And when we say redefined, what we mean is identity is something that is fairly flexible. This is something that we can work on, right? And that's actually something that I think that many human beings can relate to. because most people go through life and they're doing the best that they can, and most of us have areas in life where perhaps we think that it would be nice to improve upon a certain aspect of maybe how we see ourselves or maybe how we interact with others. And that is the really liberating thing about being a human being, is that you really do get a lot of choice in life to adapt, to revise, to improve. And this is something that we can think about in terms of how identity and communication of identity is something that's co-created. We've talked about this concept before, but if we're going to discuss the interpretive perspective of identity, we do need to account for the fact that there are both the avowed and the ascribed identity, right? And if you recall from a previous lecture, avowed identity is the type of identity that I want for myself, that I see myself as, the identity that I put out to the world, whereas ascribed identity deals with the identities that other people or society or the media system may impose upon me. Okay? So, looking at this idea of identity and identity work, we can see again how the way in which we communicate is largely shaped by our position in society, our position in a current communication interaction, and also the context with which we're interacting. So all of us know, for example, that the topics we discuss, the ways we interact, the activities that we do are different depending on whether we're engaging in communication in a familial situation, as a sibling or as a child or parent, as compared to a romantic dating situation, right? As compared to work and professional situations. So the benefit of the interpretive perspective is that it really allows us not only to look at the way that identity changes based on context, but it also allows us to look at the ways that people make sense of their experiences personally in these different contexts. Okay, so what are the meanings that our familial interactions bring to our life versus our work interactions? How do those types of interactions validate a sense of identity that we hold to be in high esteem? And what happens when we have interactions with people in these various situations that are less than desirable? How do those types of interactions shape our identity, for better or for worse? So these are all things to consider with regards to the interpretive perspective of identity. From the critical perspective, we can look at identity from a much more macro perspective. So when we talk about macro, we're looking more at these broad institutional, social, historical forces. When we look at things that are micro, we're looking at communication interactions that are much more interpersonal. We might be looking at more subtle communication things such as nonverbal cues. Okay, so we can look at communication from a micro to a macro perspective, and the critical perspective definitely is one that allows us to look at these issues from a much broader perspective, if you will. So according to the critical perspective, identity is something that is situated with regards to history, political systems, and institutions. Okay? The critical perspective also accounts for the ascribed and avowed identity, all right? But they look at it from a much more macro perspective. So rather than looking at ascribed identity in terms of the expectations that your parents might have for you, for example, the critical perspective would look at ascribed identity in terms of social structure or broad macro power structures in society, right? So the critical perspective would look at things like group membership, the ways in which my group membership shape the different privileges that I am able to have in my life, or the different opportunities that are provided to me. And this perspective allows us to look at how some groups, namely groups that are more marginalized in society, so marginalized race groups, marginalized culture groups, disability groups, sexual orientation, things like that. The critical perspective really allows us to look at the ways in which these groups tend to fall to the margins, if you will, right? So the system that we currently live in tends to give certain people more opportunities when they belong to groups that are more mainstream or dominant, whereas the people that don't get the same opportunities typically tend to be the people who are in more marginalized groups, okay? So we can look at ascribed and avowed identity in terms of macro, social, political, institutional structures that tend to privilege certain groups, and other groups don't tend to receive the same types of benefits. So what are some contexts of ascribed identity? Well, I touched on this a second ago, but we can look at ascribed identity in terms of politics or political systems, and how political systems tend to ascribe certain types of identity to people based on group membership, right? Certain types of opportunities or things like that. But we can also look at the way in which people are categorized based on race, right, or ethnic background. There is a whole host of public dialogue that continues in the public right now with regards to immigration issues, or also with regards to race relations in the USA. We have events that have taken place in recent history and in the past history that continue to bring these issues of ethnic and racial and cultural group identity and conflict to the forefront of public discussion, right? So the critical perspective, rather than just saying, well, in this one instance, this person decided to behave in a way that was discriminatory, the critical perspective would say, well, this person behaved in a way that was discriminatory towards people of this group, but they are merely enacting the routine behaviors of a broader social, historical, political system that tends to privilege certain people over others, right? So we can look at this from a critical perspective in terms of macro structural context and how they shape people's experiences, how they shape the ways in which people are viewed by more mainstream societies, and also the opportunities that people are provided in life or not given. But we can also look at things like age, if we were going to look at identity and how identity tends to be shaped from a macro perspective. One issue recently that has emerged with regards to age, and if we want to talk about privilege issues, this is kind of an interesting dynamic, but one thing we've been finding with corporate jobs is that the corporations nowadays tend to downsize in terms of having folks working there that are older. So, of course, not every corporation is doing this, all right? But if you're just looking at how you run your business from a market perspective and you're just trying to save money, when you have certain employees who have been working at the company for 30 or 40 years and they have a lot of seniority, it also follows that you have to pay them a lot of money or more money, right? Now, if I decide I want to try to cut some costs at my company, one way to do that would be to maybe, downsize or get rid of certain employees who I have to pay, X amount of money to every year. And why not bring somebody in maybe that's younger who can do the same job for less money because they don't have the same experience level and the same seniority and things like that. So we could look at that type of a scenario as a type of a structural issue, okay, that has an interplay between the economy, between institutions, and between, historical, cultural, political issues, right? So that's an interesting view on how more structural issues can shape people's identities and their experiences in the modern workplace. But many of you who are listening to this lecture have probably experienced the other side of being treated a certain way because of your age. I've heard from several of my students in these classes before that they have gone through experiences with friends or colleagues or even in corporate organizational jobs where because you are younger, let's say you're 20, 25, there's an assumption that maybe you're not as competent as somebody who's older, right? And so there is another situation of how age becomes a liability for people, right? And we can look at that from a structural, historical, institutional standpoint, right? I mean, historically, we have a lot of cultural myths surrounding the competence and the wisdom of people who are older, right? So even though that's a cultural myth or a cultural perspective on aging, we can see how with people who are younger, that can work against them. On the other hand, even though people who are older in modern corporations may have the wisdom and the experience that really helps them do a good job, because of the economic constraints that many modern organizations are facing, they might actually, try to bring in people who won't have to be paid so much because it just makes sense economically. So we can look at lots of different issues from the critical perspective. And again, the critical perspective is always looking at things from more of a macro power structure standpoint. And so you can look at various types of identity issues and various types of group classification, privilege issues from this standpoint. I've just talked through a few for you, but you can think about this standpoint with regards to various group memberships and the different opportunities that they get in life versus other groups. So in terms of minority development stages, before we get into all of the different stages that people may progress through, it's important for us to point out the fact that not every person who belongs to a minority group will progress through each of these stages throughout the course of their life. It is quite possible that some people may stay in stage 1, for example, which is the unexamined identity stage, for their entire life. The reasons for this could be several, but the main idea here is that in order to get through life in a way where people are not constantly dealing with having to explain themselves or dealing with people questioning their identity, it may be more beneficial or easier for some people just to de-emphasize their minority group membership and act to align themselves with the dominant group identity. So, stage 1 would include the unexamined identity. People in this stage probably would either not be aware of the fact that they belong to any kind of minority group, or they may not have any interest in exploring the various historical, cultural factors related to membership in this group for various reasons. It could be because they don't think it's important. It could be because they're afraid of how they might be treated if they did identify or affiliate with this group. So we can look at the fact that this stage, stage 1, includes a lack of interest exploration. People may accept the attitudes of the dominant group. And a good example of this would be individuals who do have ethnic or cultural or race backgrounds that would qualify as a minority group. However, they may be able to pass as white because it may be that they only have a small percentage of their background that is of that group. So for example, if you are half Asian and half Caucasian, or if you're a quarter Asian and 3/4 Caucasian, it's fairly easy for some folks who have that background to pass as white when it's convenient for them, right? So this would be a type of unexamined identity process where somebody chooses to simply align themselves with the more dominant group in society because it's just easier to do so. We can also look at the ways in which people might try to stylize themselves rather than just not mentioning their authentic minority background, or rather than not claiming it or talking about it. People may actually try to modify certain aspects of their visual identity so that they can pass in a certain group. So for example, the other day when I was at the store, I saw a woman working there who was helping me, and she was Asian and she had dyed her hair platinum blonde. And of course, given the topic that I teach, I had to wonder, was she trying to stylize herself to be potentially looking more like she was a member of the dominant group, or is she simply just dyeing her hair platinum blonde because that's what young women do, right? So it was definitely an interesting thing to see. Similarly, I have also seen in the past, I've seen people who will take contact lenses and they will attempt to lighten the color of their eyes through the use of contact lenses. We also know, for example, that in places other than the USA, and even in the USA, they probably have products available, but I know for sure that there are places in Africa, for example, where women there will actually buy skin cream that claims that it will whiten their identity or lighten their identity. So it will, the skin cream claims that they will have a lighter pigment on their skin. And one of the reasons that some of these women want to do this is because there is a perception, generally speaking, among the African culture that women who are black who have lighter skin are seen as more attractive or as fairer, right? So these are all ways that people might try to modify their visual identity to claim or align themselves with a group membership that's a part of the majority group. You can also see how people may refuse or choose not to eat certain foods. They may choose not to wear a certain dress or other types of stylization that might link them or connect them with their minority culture. They may also listen to music from the mainstream dominant group rather than listening to authentic musical expression. And we can also see how people tend to choose hobbies as well based on the friendships or group memberships that they have, right? So if my friends are all Caucasian American and they have very American hobbies, those are the types of hobbies that I'm probably going to want to engage in so that I can help to, reify my group membership as a part of that dominant group. We can also look at the second stage of minority development, which looks at conformity. Conformity is where people make more of a conscious decision to internalize the values or the norms of the dominant group. Conformity also takes place when people tend to verbally express positive evaluations of the dominant group and negative evaluations of a minority group. So this could happen, for example, when somebody puts down others that are in their own culture or that have a similar background affiliation. For example, you might know of someone who is of the Jewish religion, and in order to simplify things around the holidays, they just might pretend that they are Catholic or Christian so that they can engage in all the, more routine festivities and, not have to explain themselves to people who want to know why do they celebrate the holidays in this way over that way, right? Another potential example of conformity would be a situation where someone is an atheist or agnostic, and they live in a community that is mostly full of religious people, right? So if you happen to come from a background that is atheist and you live in a community where most of your friends and neighbors are strict Christians or strict Latter-day Saints, then it might be easier for you just to act like you are a part of that faith group so that you don't deal with negative treatment or views or situations where you are a part of the out group. The third stage of minority development deals with resistance and separation. Oftentimes, the resistance separation stage is stimulated by a negative experience that people may have, and because of that negative experience, people may then retreat within themselves, if you will, and they may develop a more established desire to learn about their authentic culture so that they can reestablish a sense of self that feels more authentic to them. At this stage, people may begin to reject the dominant values and practices of mainstream society, and they may work to set up their lives in a way where they don't have to engage in as much interactions with people who belong to the group that they had the negative experience with. So your book gives a good example of someone who did this. They give an example of a Japanese corporate professional female by the name of Tomiko, and she comes to the United States and learns through her experiences at her job that despite the fact that she has the same level of experience, the same rank, and the same competency as her male American coworkers, that she is treated in a non-equal way by those coworkers. So, for example, perhaps they may ask her to go get the coffee and tea when there's a meeting rather than asking the administrative assistant to do so, which would be more appropriate, right? So, and there were probably other things that she went through as well, right? But based on that negative experience of feeling like she wasn't being treated as a corporate professional, which is what she was brought to the corporation to do, was to behave in a professional manner, Tomiko decided that she was going to purposely patronize or go and seek out the businesses of other females in her community so that she could support other women who were also professionals and trying to establish themselves in terms of the business or corporate world. So the book talks about how Tomiko started to patronize businesses that were run by women, doctors who were female. Again, with this, we can see the likelihood that there is a cultural gender value of modesty as well, which would also probably motivate a woman from Japan to seek out a doctor who is a female rather than a male. Stage 4 of minority development deals with integration. This is where people achieve a sense of authentic group identity, where they know more about their group background and what it means, for example, to be a Japanese female living in the USA in 2015, all right? So in the previous example of Tomiko, you know, she perhaps was able to recontextualize her place in society. Rather than being a Japanese woman in Japan, now she lives in the United States of America. She has been able to understand her place in society. Perhaps she was able to deal with some of the issues that were challenging that she wasn't satisfied with, and maybe she was able to resolve those through open and effective communication. And also she probably was able to achieve a more established sense of group identity by creating networks with other immigrant females in the USA who are trying to establish themselves professionally, or perhaps other Japanese female immigrants in the USA. So these are ways that people can begin to explore their group identity, begin to understand how they fit into the larger society with which they live. And this tends to happen in the integration stage. This is also the stage where people are able to redirect any kind of anger or resentment towards certain dominant groups so that they can work to eliminate injustice for all groups, right? So if you were to join an organization that helps to teach people English, or that helps to help people learn the social norms that they can expect in modern corporate America, that would be a type of way that someone such as Tomiko, for example, could redirect her negative experience in a way to try to improve the standing or improve the experience of immigrants that will come in the future, or people that are currently here as well. This is also the stage where people are able to develop a more defined sense of appreciation for the self and for others. So I am able to appreciate my own identity and my own authentic background, but I'm also able to appreciate what other people bring to the table in terms of their unique identity. And a good example of what this would look like would be, you know, any number of individuals who you know who engage in social activism or becoming a part of a community agency that helps people. There are various ways that people might express their integration, but generally speaking, we see that there's an achieved sense of group identity that's more authentic. There tends to be an elimination of bitterness or anger towards dominant group society, and there tends to be an appreciation of self and others. And that appreciation is something that motivates people to want to improve the standing of other marginalized groups in society. Now, shifting gears a little bit, we're going to look at majority identity development. And as I stated at the onset of minority identity development, the first stage of majority identity development deals with the unexamined identity. And it is quite possible that people may never progress beyond stage 1 in their majority identity development. And I just want to preface this part of the lecture by saying that, because the stages are laid out in a very linear fashion. So just so that we're aware that one person could actually stay in stage 1 for their entire life and never examine their identity in any way. So stage 1 deals with an unexamined identity. At this point, there is a lack of perceived privilege or a lack of perceived membership to a dominant group. So I might know a little bit about who I am as a person, like maybe I'm a child and I know that I'm a girl and I know that I live in this town and I know that I'm in, third grade or whatever, right? But I'm unaware of the different types of social status or privileges that might be attached to these various identity groups I belong to. So for example, little boys are typically aware at a young age, let's say 5, 6, 7, okay, that they are male, right? So by 5, 6, 7, children are usually conscious and cognizant of the fact that there are physical differences between males and females, right? But there would be no way that a child at that age would even be able to begin to grasp the very different experiences that men and women have in the world based on their membership to the male or female group, okay? So this would be a good example of an unexamined identity. Another type of a situation which we could use to look at the unexamined identity would simply be those folks that we know who really haven't had much opportunity to get to know people from various backgrounds, and they haven't traveled very much. So they may not be aware of the way in which their experiences in the past have shaped their views of the world, because they really haven't experienced much of the world outside of their community, right? So staying in a fairly insulated community system and not having access to education, knowledge, awareness about other cultures, other practices, other ways of life, those types of things can also cause someone to not really examine their identity, because they basically are just like everyone else, or at least there's a perception that we're all sort of the same. And if you have that perception, there's really little need to examine your identity. The second stage of majority identity development deals with acceptance. This is where people actually are conscious of the fact that they belong to a membership community where they have some kind of social dominance. And when I say social dominance, I do not mean that all people that belong to, let's say, the male group in society act in a dominant way. What we mean when we say dominance is we mean that there are lots of people who belong to this group, first of all. So we have numbers of people. So yes, about 50% of the population is male, okay? But we also can look at dominance in terms of social positioning. So we can look at the fact, for example, that although there have been many strides made in terms of equal rights for men and women in society, that there are many social scientists that conclude, after doing research in economics and social interactions and politics and things like that, there are many social scientists that perceive that males and females still do not have the same status in society, even though we have made great strides toward that, right? So if I was, let's say, in a group that was dominant, and I was able to get to the second stage, I might actually start to accept the fact that my group is more privileged, let's say, or maybe my group has more opportunities than other groups. And I may actually begin to accept the dominant ideology that my group is better than other groups, or maybe that my group deserves to be in the position that my group is in. This can take the form of both passive acceptance. So this is basically just accepting the assumptions that underpin the fact that we live in a society that is still trying to establish equality between various different groups, okay? So I might just accept the fact that I belong to a group that's dominant, and I might not think about it much. I wouldn't call it into question probably. I might say something like, well, okay, so maybe I'm in the middle class. Maybe my parents are in the middle class, and, maybe most of my friends are in the middle class. But, we've all had to work very hard to get here, right? So, a statement like that basically accepts this idea that people who are less affluent, let's say, or that are struggling financially, have maybe chosen that life in some way, right? And certainly there are things that can shape the types of socioeconomic outcomes that we achieve in life, such as how much education we get or how much we spend building our careers or developing our careers, things like that. But in reality, there are many people who end up struggling financially not because they didn't work hard in college or didn't save money, but because they had a bad break, right? So I know of people, for example, who were doing fine until they got sick, and then the illness wiped out everything that they had, right? Or you know of people who maybe made a poor real estate decision because their real estate agent misguided them, right? And because of that, they lose their house and they don't have a place that they can call their own anymore, right? So I think that, these assumptions about what brought people to the current status that they have in life are really interesting, and I think that we always want to question what assumptions we're making about people, and ask ourselves whether these assumptions are true, or whether we're just saying something that allows us to not have to worry about these groups of people who are the folks in society that are struggling, okay? So we can look at things like a passive acceptance of inequality in society, like, well, that's just the way it is, or if those people would just work harder, they would have more. Or we can accept the dominant ideology in terms of active expression of it, okay? So I might actually consciously choose to verbally express my negative opinions towards that group, whatever group that is, right? So I might actually make statements in public about, well, if poor folks should just work harder, and then they wouldn't have the money problems they have, okay? So we can look at the difference in stage 2 between passive acceptance of society as it is, which is basically just saying to yourself, well, that's just the way it is, or people choose this based on what they do. And then the more active expression of acceptance is making statements that are public, or not even public, statements even with friends or family, that conclude, assumptions about why it is people are in this situation. Okay, so this would be stage 2 for majority development. Moving on. Stage 3 looks at resistance. This stage is also something that allows people to regroup, if you will, reassess their position in society. In some cases, stage 3 may actually be prompted or provoked by a negative experience, much like the resistance stage in minority development is, okay? So maybe stage 3 might be provoked or prompted by seeing a film about a certain group of people that really brings to light the struggles that they face, that allows you to see their humanity in a way where you were never able to before. That could be like a type of experience. Maybe you have an experience with someone you know at work or at school or one of your family friends, and maybe you see someone being treated in a very unequal way, and that prompts you to call into question the current system, right? So these are types of situations that can provoke resistance among majority group members. But one of the first parts of stage 3 deals with acknowledging the fact that we live in a society where some people have more advantages than others. And there is a shift typically in this stage from blaming the minority group or the marginalized group, whatever group that is, to blaming the majority group for the plights of these various cultures. Now, is the blame game useful? I don't think so. All right. Is it important to acknowledge that we live in a society where some groups have more advantages over others? Yeah, it is important to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean that those of us who have certain advantages or opportunities are supposed to feel bad about it, but it is important to tell the truth about the society that we live in, because at the end of the day, each of us play a role in the social, professional interactions that we have. So if I'm aware of the fact that there are certain types of structural inequities or structural inequalities that might cause certain groups to have more privileges or advantages than others, what that means for me is that I can do my best with that knowledge to behave in ways where I am not reinforcing a society that does not treat people equally, okay? So what that means basically is if I'm able to acknowledge the fact that we live in a society where some groups do receive more advantages or opportunities than others, all right, then that allows me with that knowledge to behave in ways that would work against inequality rather than reinforcing it. Does that make sense? So what that can look like, obviously in my line of work, I teach intercultural communication. So what that looks like in my life is I talk a lot about these issues through lectures like this or through discussions that I have with classes or things like that. But it also sometimes might play out just in my everyday interactions out in my community. So for example, sometimes I will go shopping and sometimes will notice that if I am standing at the checkout counter, that I'll walk up to the checkout counter and I will be coming up to the checkout counter after someone who has been standing there. And if that person is African American or Asian American or something, I have noticed on more than one occasion that if I am standing there with someone who belongs to a minority group, that I am the one who gets helped first. And so what happens is that, the service provider will come up and say, "Can I help you, ma'am?" Or "Is there something I can help you with?" And in that situation, the best thing that I can do is to say something like, "Oh, well, I think that this person or these people were waiting first," right? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a really huge, demonstration of equality in order to make a difference in small day-to-day interactions like that, okay? So shifting from minority to majority blame, we don't want to be getting stuck in a bunch of feelings of guilt or, feeling bad. We do not want to be getting stuck in feelings of resentment towards other groups, whatever group that might be. The best thing that we can do in these situations is really look at the evidence, acknowledge the reality, and behave in the most ethical way that we can for the given situation that we're in, okay? Again, I just talked about this idea of collective guilt a second ago, but minority groups sometimes will experience emotions that tend to be cultivated on a collective level. So for example, a lot of folks from Germany who obviously are German, okay, because of the past events during the Holocaust, I have read in multiple articles that several Germans even today still feel a very extreme sense of collective guilt because of the participation of the German people in the Holocaust. Okay, so that would be an example of collective guilt. On the other hand, we also want to be aware of this issue of collective resentment. And basically what that is that is a type of collective anger or resentment that people may have towards certain groups that may be based on the real or imagined interactions that took place between you and other groups, right? So for example, if I grew up in an environment where I heard stories about, this particular group and how much they had hurt people of my culture, it would be very easy for me to start to feel a sense of collective resentment towards that group, whoever that group is, right? So these are things that we want to think about, especially with regards to majority and minority development. And collective guilt and collective resentment sometimes are taking place without people even realizing it. So I encourage you to look at your own sense of yourself and your relationship to the world that you've experienced and see if there are any areas where you are experiencing collective guilt and collective resentment or collective resentment. And if you find that you are, I suggest that you work on resolving that or letting that go. Because in order to really be effective intercultural communicators, these types of strong emotional orientations need to be managed effectively, because otherwise they can shape the way that you end up treating people, okay? So these are things that we definitely want to be conscious of. In terms of the resistance stage, there are different types of resistance. You can have passive resistance to the majority group. So I would not maybe verbally say something, but I would just cognitively or psychologically think through it. And I might think to myself, well, I definitely don't agree with this, right? However, you can also actively resist, and this is where people might verbally denounce unequal conditions. They might challenge someone verbally if someone tells a racist joke or a gendered joke or a joke that makes people with disabilities look bad, things like that. Stage 4 of the majority identity development deals with redefinition. This is where people move beyond collective guilt or collective resentment. They may work to actively reduce inequality on a regular basis. This is very similar to the redefinition stage of minority identity development as well. So for example, they may challenge people if they hear someone telling a racist joke. They might get much more verbal about talking about various issues related to social equality. In the last stage, where people achieve integration, we see that they're able to enjoy their own identity and be aware of the different opportunities and advantages that they have based on their identity, but they're also able to appreciate and enjoy other people's unique cultural backgrounds, values, and modes of expression, symbols, artifacts, music, food, things like that. This is where people will start to explore cultures that may be related to their own background, but they also might explore other cultures that they hadn't looked at before, okay? And this is also integrated into their sense of self, a self that appreciates their own culture and their own ethnic cultural backgrounds, but also a self that appreciates other people's cultures and that sees the importance of staying connected to these cultures as we progress through our lives. So at this point, people would probably celebrate their own heritage through various cultural activities or discussions. So you might be German American, and so maybe you may make it a priority to go to, the German Fest, or to make sure you go to any kind of German music performances or things like that. But you may also appreciate other cultures, and you may make it a point to go to any kinds of cultural celebrations that are taking place in your community. So these are the majority identity development stages. There are some similarities between minority identity development and majority identity development, but it's important just to be conscious of the different stages that people may go through based on their group development. It is also possible that people may belong to both a minority group and a majority group, if that makes sense to you. So for example, I myself belong to a majority Caucasian race group in the United States, okay? But I belong to a minority gendered group at the university because there do not tend to be as many female professors as there are male. So in these types of situations, people may actually progress through both types of stages depending on what aspect of their identity is salient or important or noticeable to them at that time. Moving on to the final stage of this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about stereotypes and about what they are and what function they serve and how we can effectively manage these stereotypes so that they don't negatively affect our communication interactions with other people. So as I've said before in these lectures, stereotypes are broad, sweeping beliefs or ideas that we have about people who belong to various groups in society. So for example, we might have stereotypes of men being macho or women being dainty or feminine, things like that. You may also have stereotypes that you see in the media that blacks are violent or Asians are smart. Okay, these are all, typically cited stereotypes. If you ask people, what are some stereotypes that you've heard of? These types of stereotypes tend to come forth time and time again, okay? And these are examples of very broad, sweeping beliefs about a group of people, which in reality, I know a lot of women, for example, that are not dainty at all. And I also know a lot of men who really are not that macho. And I know lots of black folks who are nonviolent. I also know some Asians who are really not that smart. So, we can all find examples where these stereotypes just don't apply. So it's important just to be aware of the fact that although there might be a grain of truth to some stereotypes, and oftentimes these stereotypes that we tend to adopt are talked about in the home. You might hear it being said by your friends, your parents, your family, but we also see a lot of stereotypes playing out in the media. And what's very interesting about the media is that we tend to see the same types of stereotypes about the same types of groups over and over again. And once you see the same thing over and over again, eventually you start to believe that as reality, right? Especially if you don't have much experience interacting with the people who are being depicted on the media, right? So I encourage you all to think about what stereotypes you have about various groups in society, where you formed those stereotypes, and how you think those stereotypes could potentially be influencing the way you view people and also the way you treat them and interact with them. Or in some cases, we might avoid interacting with people because of the stereotypes we have, right? Stereotypes serve a very important function in assisting us to develop expectations about what we can expect in our world on a day-to-day basis. So although stereotypes do serve an important heuristic shortcut function, they tend to be damaging, especially when dealing with effective intercultural communication. As I stated a few moments ago, the media tend to perpetuate stereotypes quite a bit, and many of us may adopt stereotypes without even realizing it. Stereotypes can be based on someone's race background, they can be based on someone's age group, they can be based on someone's gender or their sexuality. They can also be based on national origin or what country people are from. Stereotypes can be based on your socioeconomic status or how much money you make, okay, what type of a job you do. Stereotypes can be based on ability or disability. You might even be able to come up with some others. I'm sure religion would be another type of stereotype that we could come up with, okay? Are there any other stereotypes that you tend to see evoked in the media that maybe I haven't listed here? Those would be interesting to consider as well. So in terms of stereotypes and the relationship between stereotypes and prejudice, there's a few things that we want to be able to distinguish. First of all, prejudice deals with attitudes that we might have towards groups. On the previous slide, I talked about stereotypes as a type of mental image or mental idea about what groups of people are like. So for the purpose of this class, we want to be able to distinguish the difference between stereotypes and prejudice in the following way. Stereotypes are cognitive, mental models or mental impressions or mental ideas that we have about groups of people, whereas prejudice deals with the attitudinal or emotional component of those feelings we have towards certain groups, okay? Stereotypes are cognitive and psychological. Prejudice is affective, attitudinal, and emotional. Feelings towards certain groups may be positive, so you might have a positive prejudice towards a certain group, or you may have a negative prejudice towards a certain group, or you may have a neutral feeling towards some groups. Oftentimes, stereotypes can lead to prejudice, which is one of the reasons why we discuss this topic in a course like this. And given the fact that a lot of times we have stereotypes that we may not even be aware of, this is one of the reasons why I ask students to think of the stereotypes that have shaped their impressions up until this point in life, because in order to really make sure that we are not behaving in ways that are prejudicial, we want to make sure that we're not applying stereotypes to the people that we meet. Negative views towards people in terms of cognitive impressions or negative emotional attitudes that we have towards certain groups can definitely impact the behavior that we use when we interact with people, right? It can also impact whether we are even willing to communicate with certain people or whether we work to avoid interacting with certain types of people. Sometimes stereotypes and prejudice actually develop because people have group esteem needs. Well, what does that mean? Well, sometimes people tend to develop stereotypes because it makes the world easier to understand, okay? And sometimes I learn how to view my group through the attitudes and views that I develop about other groups in society, okay? So stereotypes and prejudice can develop based on group esteem needs or needing to feel good about my group, right? They also may develop based on perceptions of threat that I may feel about other groups in society, negatively affecting the ability of my group to do whatever it is that they're trying to do, whether it's get a job that's good, or whether it's maintain the safety of our borders, or whatever it is, okay? And so in terms of the function that prejudice sometimes serves, which keep people using prejudice in day-to-day interactions, is the utilitarian function. There are several here. We're going to talk about them one by one. And the utilitarian function of prejudice suggests that the reason that people evoke prejudice or adopt prejudice is because doing so somehow gives them access to certain types of rewards. So, for example, if people in my group feel negatively towards others who belong to a certain group, whatever group that might be, okay, it may be in my best interest to just conform to the attitudes that my group has about that group, that other group, rather than to stand up for my personal views, to try to convince them that their attitudes are wrong, right? So in this sense, I have maybe some social rewards and some in-group affiliation rewards that I might be able to enjoy if I simply go along with the prejudicial norm that seems to be circulating through my group. We might also use prejudice for an ego defensive function. This is primarily for self-protection. So one of the ways that the ego defensive function works is that if I am able to view a certain group in a negative way, then by default, my group tends to look especially good or positive. Does that make sense? Interesting, for sure. A third function of prejudice is the value expressive function. This view suggests that people are concerned with reinforcing attitudes that are important. Okay, so in this sense, the value expressive function allows people to engage in a type of a collective prejudice where they're able to reinforce the identity of the group through reinforcing attitudes that the group holds to be important. A fourth function of prejudice is the knowledge function, and this was referenced a few slides ago. We talked about the heuristic shortcut of stereotypes. This is very similar to that. And basically what this means is that if I have certain attitudes or assumptions or feelings or stereotypes about certain groups, it allows me to organize my world in a certain way where I can find things to be predictable. Okay? So from this perspective, people simply utilize things like stereotypes and prejudice because it simply makes their life easier to organize, and it allows them to view their world in more of a structured way, which ultimately gives people a sense of agency and a perception that they have control over their life. So these are the different functions of prejudice. The knowledge function also can be very automatic. People may not even realize that they're doing it when they're using this function. And as I said a second ago, it lets people make sense of the world in an easier way. Discrimination takes place when people allow negative ideas or attitudes or feelings to influence the behavior that they enact towards others. People may discriminate towards others based on race or ethnicity or culture. They may discriminate based on gender or sexual orientation. They may discriminate based on religion or lack of religion, as we've discussed here in this class so far. Discrimination may take place based on class or socioeconomic status. It may also take place based on the language you speak or accent, and also country of origin. Discrimination also can take place with regards to physical or mental ability or disability. So one of the reasons why we spend time talking about the difference between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination is because most people have stereotypes and most people have prejudice. But if we're able to become aware of what those stereotypes are and which prejudices we hold on to, then we are more able to prevent ourselves from behaving in ways that are discriminatory towards others. The reason for this is by understanding our own attitudes and beliefs about certain groups of people, that gives us information about areas where we may need to fill in the gaps, for example. So for instance, if I notice that I tend to have very negative views towards a particular group in society, perhaps what I could do with that is I could seek out more knowledge about the actual character traits of people belonging to that group. How do I seek out that knowledge? Well, There are multiple ways that you can do that. There are books, there are scholarly research articles that talk about value orientations of various cultures. There are films that portray certain groups in a more accurate way than others, okay? You can go to events that celebrate certain types of cultural dimensions. There are lots of things that you can do to work to reduce some of these negative attitudes and to increase the knowledge and awareness that you have. So, just to reiterate, most people have prejudice and most people also have stereotypes. But by becoming aware of those areas where we have judgments and negative attitudes, we are able to do our best to minimize the likelihood that we will treat people in a discriminatory way when we interact with them. Okay, so what that means then is if I have a negative attitude about certain types of people in particular, then that means that when I interact with people belonging to that group, I need to be especially careful, right? Make sure that I'm treating people equally, make sure that I'm not projecting negative attitudes onto others, make sure that I don't go into a communication interaction with expectations about what people are going to be like, right? So take people for who they are and do the best you can to treat people in the best possible way. My fundamental belief about human beings is that they are good, and it really is my conviction that most people are looking to treat most other human beings well, okay? In some situations, maybe we don't have the knowledge or the awareness that we need in order to do so, but that is one of the reasons why we talk about issues like this in a course like this. So I appreciate all of your willingness to think about this issue critically and objectively so that if there are any areas that you feel like you maybe want to adapt so that you can be more effective in intercultural communication, you can do so. And by the way, this is a process that is continuing on throughout the life cycle. I even have my own stereotypes still that I have to deal with, and I still have situations in my life where I have to become conscious to behave in ways where I am treating people equally because of the fact that I am a product of a society that promotes certain stereotypes and prejudicial attitudes, okay? So just because you get a PhD in intercultural communication, it doesn't mean that you are exempt from this process either. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to realize that this is a very human process, that there's nothing wrong with you if you have certain attitudes towards certain groups, and that this is a really great opportunity to embrace some of the ideas that we're discussing here so that you can modify or structurally or cognitively restructure some of the assumptions that you have, ultimately so that you can be a more effective communicator. Okay, so I do appreciate you being willing to consider these issues. If you have other questions that come up about issues related to any of our lectures, please let me know, and I'm happy to address those questions. Managing prejudice is a very important part of effective intercultural communication. And as we finish up this chapter, I just wanted to preface this slide by letting you all know that the experience of stereotypes and prejudice is a very human process. This does not make you a bad person if you have discovered that you do have stereotypes or prejudice about certain groups. And in fact, if you talk to most people, you will discover that most people have stereotypes at the very least, even if they have tried to work to reduce negative emotional responses or negative emotional attitudes towards various groups. So managing prejudice effectively is really something that all of us have to think about in the modern international global environment. And so one of the first things that we can do to manage prejudice is to become consciously aware of the various groups that we stereotype, what those stereotypes may be, whether they're positive, negative, neutral, whatever, okay? And what is the impact of these stereotypes? Do you notice that there are certain groups of people that you tend to want to avoid? Similarly, are there certain groups of people that you tend to seek out for interaction? Also, you can think about what your expectations are for people when you do interact with them. So when you're communicating with people from certain groups, do you notice, for example, that you bring up certain topics or that you expect that they will be interested in talking about certain issues? Are there certain types of emotional issues that you notice when you interact with people from certain groups. So, have you noticed that you have more uncomfortableness or discomfort, or do you have more anxiety interacting with people from certain groups over others? These are all cues that we can use to help us understand which groups we stereotype and what kind of impact this can have on our routine communication. The second thing we can do is to inform stereotypes. What this means is that we actively seek out information that allows us to learn more about people belonging to various groups, and we step outside of our comfort zone. So we might do things like travel to try to learn about other cultures, or we might read books, or we might watch films, or we might go to cultural events or cultural celebrations, okay, where people are actively expressing and celebrating culture. These are all ways that we can inform stereotypes. In addition, we can inform stereotypes by working to interact with people that we might normally avoid, right? Working to interact with people who are different than us, that maybe we've been taught to avoid, definitely serves as a type of mechanism to help inform stereotypes, because what happens is you start to get to know people beneath the stereotypes that you have, and over time we start to realize that there are many commonalities that all of us share with each other as human beings in a modern world, as compared to many of the differences that sometimes separate us. Okay, so you work to step outside of the comfort zone. And then a third thing that you can do is work to monitor your stereotypes. Are there certain stereotypes that tend to be evoked under certain conditions? Have you noticed any kinds of consistencies with these stereotypes or changes? These are 3 ways that we can effectively work to manage our prejudice so that we can work to be effective communicators in a modern global environment. Now, I know that this chapter has dealt with a lot of interesting issues. We've talked a lot about culture and identity processes, and I really appreciate your willingness to look at this issue of stereotypes and prejudice. And I'm aware of the fact that for some of you, you might be feeling uncomfortable with the fact that you have any stereotypes, but please be aware of the fact that this is a very human process. It does not make you a bad person. The main thing is that when you acquire the knowledge about the fact that you have stereotypes, the main thing is that you work to responsibly manage that issue, okay? So as long as you are really doing your best to try to keep things in a holistic view and to work to inform stereotypes that you think might negatively impact your ability to be an effective communicator, you're doing great. So keep the faith. I appreciate your attention to these issues, and as always, if you have any questions regarding issues related to this chapter or any of the other chapters that we've discussed up until now, please feel free to let me know. You can email me or you can come to my office hours and I can help you out then, okay? Thank you for your time and attention, and I will talk to you all in the next lecture.